Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Void Souls, a comprehensive retrospective. It is obviously not going to be actually totally comprehensive. It is basically as much as I can possibly remember and document about the experience of developing and releasing an indie game in 2024. That's when we released it. We started it way earlier. Just to kind of give you a bit of a rundown of what I'm going to be covering in this video, I wanted to start with a bit of an overview where I'm just going to basically take you through a timeline of the development and production of the game from beginning to end. And then I'll be doing a few deep dives into some aspects in which I was, quote unquote, more so involved than not. Obviously, the team is more than just myself, and I'll be talking about the rest of the team throughout this presentation. Um, but these were kind of the things that were mostly under my purview, and I'll be starting kind of more granular with animation and enemy AI, and then just kind of with each feature widening out into game design and creative direction. So, let's talk about the timeline. Let's talk about where all this started for Void Souls. For context, in April 2022, I also have the date in the top right corner up there to kind of give you a bit of an idea of how long this timeline really is. In April 2022, we, as a studio, Fine Art Reflection Studios, were sitting on self-publishing 3 games: Containment, Twin Cop, and The Gardener and the Wild Vines. All of them had been reviewed fairly well. Containment was a $2 minimalist puzzle game, which, didn't sell too terribly well, but also wasn't really trying to be a blockbuster game. It was basically us just trying to release something on Steam because we didn't know how to do it yet. Twin Cop was actually the first game that we started as a studio, and that got a lot of great reception. It won a few GameDev awards. I can't remember which ones off the top of my head now, but we took it to a lot of conferences. This was our first kind of big game as a studio. And then we followed that up with something that was tonally completely different, with a narrative platformer that was nominated for a GLAD Award, nominated for an Indicate Award, and this was kind of our most recent game that kind of continued to kind of bolster our existence as a studio, so to speak. As of the end of the Gardener Wild Vines, Finite Reflection Studios was basically just 3 part-time people. It was myself, it was Zach, who is our sound designer, and it was Eric, who is also in the chat right now, who is our kind of lead engineer slash backend engineer, and platform manager, and a bunch of other roles. So that's kind of where we were. We also had started on something after the Gardener of the Wild Vines, which was something that was called Captain Dino Hater slash Captain Raygun slash a couple of other names that we had considered. But that had started to stall out after we tried to take what was originally a Ludum Dare Jam game, which we're still very proud of, but we kind of struggled to take it from a jam version into a full release game that we were going to put on Steam. And so during that stalling out of that project, I had decided to just prototype something new. I had just played Elden Ring and was obsessed, but I was like, yeah, there's no way I can make Elden Ring. I don't have the talent or the capacity or the team to make that happen. So I'm just gonna prototype this for temporary. This is all meant to be temporary assets. I was just gonna do a triangle. I was just gonna do little shapes. I'm gonna do I don't know, a weird grungy aesthetic because I also had just watched the Batman, the newest one with what's his face in it? Whatever. It was cool. It was grungy. It was very red. I was just like, I don't know why. I really like that aesthetic, and so I wanted to do that for the aesthetic here. So then I did that, and then I asked our friend Vivi to make some music for this prototype. I was like, hey, it seemed like a fun thing. And Vivi was like, yeah, sure, how about this? And she absolutely crushed it with music and delivered something that is still there, basically as was written for the original prototype in the published game. Um, but yeah, I made this. I wasn't sure what was going to happen with it. And through the wonderful power of friendship, I was convinced to release this on itch and then later on Steam. We really, as a team, didn't think that this needed to go any further than a prototype stage because, again, it was just a triangle. Like, what are we going to do with this? And bit by bit, like, our friends who played it, who hadn't seen it before, they were like, I don't know, there's something really compelling about this triangle, so why don't you go ahead and put it on to itch and then maybe Steam later. And so we did. We kind of realized, like, what do we stand to lose? What's the worst that could happen if we put this on Steam? So we did. And we had, like, far more interest in it than we expected. People who found it also told us the same thing that our friends were saying, which was, hey, that's kind of fun. That's kind of cool, actually. And it's got a lot of charm, and I want to play more of it. And so people said they want to play more. We were like, cool, we'll make more. We're still not sure how we're going to make money on this, but we're all doing this part time anyway, so we'll just kind of keep our expectations low and not really try to make it too big. And yeah, we'll make more. We put out a very careless roadmap. This was actually the second iteration of the roadmap. As you can see, we had to iterate on it because we had no idea what we were making yet, and it took us some time to figure out what we were making. Um, and the one thing we didn't consider was what is the best that could happen. And the best that could happen is that Iron Pineapple plays your game. The video gets like nearly 3 million views, and uh, your Steam page just blows the hell up. And you have a ton of people coming into your Steam page demanding even more information about this elusive roadmap and what the future of the project is. We were just suddenly like inundated with players on the Steam page in a way that we just did not expect would happen. Um, the other thing that happened as a result, almost directly from this video, is that we got a cold call from a publisher. Um, and thus began the nearly half a year long publisher negotiation process. Where, as I mentioned, the YouTube video from Iron Pineapple came out in December of 2022. January of 2022 is when we first had a bit of a cold call with, or that was when we got the cold call Discord. After presumably they looked at our numbers and they looked at our store page and they realized that we had something special on our hands. We had a call where we gave them a pitch deck in February. It took us roughly a month to get that pitch deck together, figure out internally what it is we're making, and how much money we were asking for, and how much time we were asking for, and how much scope we were thinking. So we got all that sorted, and we put all that into a pitch deck. And we had a call with them in February. Then after that went well, they asked to have another meeting, and I told them, hey, I've already bought tickets to GDC, which, for those of you who don't know, is the Game Developer Conference in San Francisco. So we went out and decided to have an in-person meeting there. I had originally planned to try to meet with other publishers while we were there, but did not do well at that. I have learned through this entire process that just in general, businessy things is not my forte and not my favorite thing to do. I think I'm getting better at doing it, but in the end, it worked out that our publisher was the only publisher we met with there because the in-person meeting in GDC also went well, which led to us receiving an informal offer in April, which was then followed up with some negotiations in May, where we had multiple meetings, making sure that we were aligned on the finer details of all of this, which resulted in a formal offer being given to us in June, which we then took to our lawyer to get a good redlining, and we discussed, down to the legalese verbiage to make sure we were all good and happy with it. And then finally, it was signed in July. From January to July was the entire publisher negotiation process, and it was honestly pretty exhausting. I was very lucky in that the publisher that we work with and the people that I was negotiating with at the time were all very cordial and nice and understanding and didn't really pressure me and or our team in any way. So it was a very healthy negotiation process, especially considering throughout this entire time I was just getting as much advice as I could from other people who have gone down this road to kind of understand what to expect, what are the pitfalls to watch out for, what are some of the things to be worried about. And we just seemed to dodge red flag after red flag throughout this timeline. Um, So yeah, here we are in July. We've signed. During this entire time, it's also worth noting that I was still working a full-time job, and one of the parts that was tricky to negotiate in May and June was them saying like, "Hey, we're not really interested in signing this game unless we know you have at least one full-time developer on this project." And realistically speaking, that full-time developer needed to be me on account of the number of hats that I wear and the amount of money it would cost otherwise to just have a bunch of contract developers make the game as opposed to having me do what I usually do, which is wear a ton of hats and do a lot of the creative direction. So around June, I put in my notice at my day job, and when we signed in July, I really hit the ground running full-time operations on this project. One of the things that we also did during this process, roughly around November. Oh, so actually, yeah, this was actually after we signed officially. Then in November, Eric and myself flew out to London, which is where our publisher is based, to have an in-person meeting with them where we had more kind of creative direction aligning. And one of the things that they wanted to discuss while we were out there was iterating on our art style, which, when you've been working on a game, we started on this in April-ish of 2022, and this is now November 2023. This is not a new project by any means, and it was kind of terrifying to be asked to change our art style at this point. Thankfully, we met with the artist who the art director of our publisher had recommended. And this artist is Anna Hollenrake, and they just knocked it out of the park. These are actually some of the first concept sketches that Anna sent us, and when we saw them, we were just like, yeah, you know what? We should update our art style. I didn't know our game could look this good. Because anything that we had done prior to that was just me trying to wear too many hats, and as a result, just making some relatively unappealing Photoshop textures that really did not convey much in terms of style or emotion. And comparing that to these concept sketches that Anna sent us, we were just like, yeah, this has so much more personality right out the gate. If we can accomplish anything even close to these concepts, we'll be happy. So as much as I also felt kind of terrified about us doing this in November 2023 for how long we've been working on it, this was really the perfect timing for us to try something like this. Any later, and it would have been very painful because we only had a couple of areas done so far, so the amount of art that needed to be redone was, relatively speaking, minimal. Um, and then Anna just like knocked it out of the park with this key art following that, where they were just like, "Hey, we're going to need some new key art because we want to put out a Steam page sooner than later. We don't know what the rest of the game looks like because we haven't made it yet, but we need some key art that shows what the game is like." And so this was kind of a fun and weird experience where Anna and I kind of worked together for a little while, just kind of trying to make sure we conveyed a lot while not conveying too much, because we also didn't know what the game was yet. All we knew was that it was a triangle and it gets a sword and some other weapons, and there's other shapes that are bad and you fight them, and it's kind of stylish. And then Anna made this, and then this kind of became a bit of a mood board for us as a team to say like, hey, if we can make the game live up to this art, we'll be happy. Um, which then brought us to that official announcement where we were going to announce the game as being officially published by our publisher, and this was just a surreal experience. In March of 2024, I flew out to UK for a 10-day press tour, basically, where I went between London, Bath, and Birmingham and Brighton to meet with PC Gamer, with Edge Magazine, with just a bunch of different journalists and meetings that the publisher lined up for us to talk about the game. I thought that I had like gotten tired of like pitching the game at, I don't know, GDC and other places where I've been, where I have to explain the game over and over again with an elevator pitch. I thought it was tiring to do that at like places like DreamHack, where I just have to pitch over and over again. Um, this was exhausting on a different level, because it was basically just like, okay, now you're going to sit in this room with this journalist who's going to record this conversation with you for about 2 hours, and for those 2 hours you're going to say the exact same thing that you just said to that other journalist about 2 hours ago when you were down the street at their office, and then tomorrow you're going to be in another office and you're going to say the same thing again. But it was, at the end of the day, it was really worth it, both from just a learning experience as well as getting to then buy Edge magazine, open it up, and see a two-page spread about our game with all that written out. Um, and we announced officially that the game was going to be published by our publisher at Insomnia, which is basically kind of like a DreamHack in the UK. You can see they really made a very cool booth for us with this nice big printed backdrop and some sets and some RGB lighting. We had like 8 computers, and it was a busy event, and we had great placement for there. So it was really cool, just kind of getting to see like what a real um, I don't know, just what a real announce PR process looks like for an indie game. And it was very kind of motivating to see just how much confidence they were putting in us that we would make a good game, that they would do all this for us, and still leave basically all the creative direction of the game up to us. Which then brought us to actually making the damn thing. Because now we had internally set a loose release window of end of 2024, and we'd already spent a good bit of time waffling creatively during the negotiation time period. We spent a good bit of time also trying to grow the team. We hired our friend Nick Shooter, who came to us from Rockstar to do level design, and we hired Miranda to help supplement our art pipeline. And from February to November 2024, we slowly developed a development pipeline that got us really just pumping stuff out at a breakneck pace, while still giving ourselves enough time to play test and iterate and make something that we were really proud of. And I like to kind of describe this process with an analogy of Legos. I don't know if this analogy works as well for others as it does for me, but I just find it a compelling analogy to describe the way that we worked, which is that myself and the team, me leading kind of as a creative director, we would design the Legos. We would decide what the Legos are. Eric, as our kind of back-end slash engineer lead, would help make the Lego factory, basically make sure that whatever Lego ideas we have, we're making the Legos in a way that makes sense and won't break the bank. Anna and Miranda would make art for the Legos. The Legos would look pretty. I then would actually make the physical Legos, aka in terms of Unity, like the Unity prefabs, and then make them move good, because I would animate them as well. Whether they were enemies, whether they were bosses, whether they were environmental hazards or objects or whatever. Nick would then take those Legos and make the world. Nick was the one who was kind of playing with Legos in the most traditional sense, just getting objects tossed over the hedge to him and being like, hey, go, I gave you a bunch of trees, go make a forest. I gave you a bunch of rocks, go make some mines. And then Vivi would make, and then Zach would make Legos sound good, so that when you go play with them, it sounds cool. And then Vivi would make music for playing with Legos, which would we would basically, between Vivi and Zach, their stuff would get done, it would go into the game, and it would just be perfect every time. from February to November 2024 is when we basically made 90% of the game. So you can see here this red highlighted section was all that we had at the beginning of February 2024, and then anything that's not in that red section was made after that. And that's not even all of it, because this is basically like a cross section of the game world. The mines over here that you see goes like 4 stories deep. The factory slash swamp is 2 stories tall. I'm missing some pieces of the mountain here because again the mountain is like a multiple height thing. There's a secret prison up off to the north over here. We just cranked out basically like 15 hours, 10 hours of gameplay in like February, November, however many months that is. Um, and it was kind of a surreal experience, to be honest. And so surreal in that like there's really not much else to say about this other than the fact that by the end of that we launched. um, on launch day, I know I can speak at the very least for myself and Nick and Eric. I'm not sure how much uh, the rest of the team were doing this, but we were just like Twitch multi-streaming, multi-screen, multitasking between like I think at one point my partner came in was just had to force me to close like 10 windows because I had like 10 different Twitch streams on at the same time. I had a different Twitch stream up on my phone. I had my laptop out where I was hot fixing things while I was watching stuff. Um, it was chaotic. I and no one on my team had really ever released a game and then been able to open up Twitch and see just this many strangers playing the game. Um, and so we were all just kind of frantically like bouncing from stream to stream, like just trying to catch any bug that we could catch and just trying to chat with each streamer to see what they were and were not liking to make sure that people were liking the game. Um, and spoiler alert, people liked the game. That was kind of the most surprising thing for me personally. It was just the fact that people didn't hate it. I think we had been so knee deep in development for so long that like everything was so old news to me that then watching people play it for the first time and seeing all this stuff that we've been seeing for years and feeling like it's so old, seeing their reaction as if it's the first time they're seeing it was kind of making me see it again for the first time as well. And I think that was a really special experience. We did a day one patch, a week one patch, and a month one patch immediately following launch to kind of address some immediate points of feedback that we saw. And yeah, I just wanted to capture a few kind of reactions from the team. This is not in chronological order, but it does convey each team member's unique perspective on the launch. Um, and yeah, I appreciate that, Eric. I looked through all our messages and I couldn't find a single message where you were just celebrating. The first message that I saw that was about the game that anyways, you were just like right back to business and that's what I love about you. Anyways, that's the timeline. I could talk about the touchy-feely aspects of launching a game till forever, in the interest of getting into some nitty-gritty game dev stuff, and also in the interest of not having this talk take longer than an hour. I'm gonna do some deep dives into some specific aspects that I kind of was working on more closely. So we'll start with the animation. Um, for starters, I'm not going to cover stuff like this too much, but I did want to just kind of like throw this out there in case anyone's watching this and you aren't familiar. Um, Make sure you know your principles of animation. There's also this great thing that I saw like a long time ago that I had to find again for this presentation, which was created by this guy right down here, Jorge Canedo. Um, it's the 10 principles of motion design. It's almost all exactly the same as the principles of animation, which come from the Illusion of Life book. But every single one of these principles are incorporated in some manner or the other in every single animation of this game. You just have to understand these principles if you want to make pleasing looking animations. Um, so what was the art kind of what was our animation limitations? What did I have to work with in this game? Because it is 2D, and these are the enemies we're looking at. Um, Animating in 2D means you only have two axes to work in. You have the X and the Y. That's it. Which means like I was pretty hard pressed to find other examples of games like ours that have very you know intense Souls-like combat, but also present from a purely 2D top-down perspective. There are plenty of three-quarters view kind of top-down adventure games with combat. I mean, Hades is probably the closest example to this, but like even that benefits from the subtle third dimension that they get that we didn't have, and so there was a lot of kind of breaking ground here for me personally, trying to figure out how do I take all these shapes and animate them. Now this is an animation, but I also did the visual design for all these enemies, and this was another challenge, was kind of creating, with the limited aesthetic that we had, creating shapes such that every single enemy was distinct from one another, while fitting an overarching aesthetic, while not getting too skeuomorphic, in the sense like this bear is probably the most representative of a real world creature. Like that wolf maybe a little bit too, if you can tell that that's a wolf. If you haven't played the game, you may not realize, but that's a frog right there. I kind of wanted to like strike this weird balance of like abstract and also kind of familiar, but also abstract. And that was a fun challenge, but it also meant a lot of limitation in terms of art, because, and of course we didn't need to do it this way, this was just something I wanted to try, and there are probably better art decisions we could have made. Um, but with each enemy being just a solid shape, and with kind of a polygonal aesthetic being a core part of the visual identity of the game, I wanted to kind of maintain their shape a lot. So another limitation was the fact that these shapes, the way they look, like that's the shape. I don't really squash and stretch their bodies too much. I don't animate their body parts moving separately. The only exceptions to that rule were the bear, who this is used just once as a kind of like a mini boss, and this flower, which technically is kind of two-ish parts, and the wolf, I guess, because their tails were animated separately to look like tails. So there were very few cases where I broke that rule, but for the most part, like I had to animate each of these enemies as just a solid block and their weapon as a separate object. The other, of course, the major limitation was the fact that I was the animator on this game. Every animation in the game was done by me, and for each of these enemies, obviously some of the starter enemies just have an attack, but some of these later enemies have quite a range of attacks that all needed to be animated, balanced, and implemented. So, a lot of limitations that kind of butted heads with the limited resources that we had to work with. The other thing that I did a lot of work on in regards to animation was juice. I think if you have seen any of my game development history before, you know that this is my personal thing that I like to focus on, is creating like really satisfying, juicy interactions. And so I just want to do like a little slow-mo breakdown of the thing that you do the most from beginning to end of the game, which is hitting enemies with your weapon. This is all stuff that I think like I know that the creator of Smash Bros did a whole like series on creating satisfying combat as well. I definitely give that a watch, because I think that he obviously does a much better job of breaking all the stuff down. And it's all stuff that's been done a million times before, but it never hurts to just kind of see it in detail. The first thing that I implemented that like had the most immediate and noticeable impact on making the gameplay feel satisfying was hit stun. You can see here in this clip there's about 4 frames of hit stun. That amount of hit stun actually scaled depending on the percent of health that was removed from the enemy, multiplied by a hit stun modifier on the weapon. So like certain weapons that are meant to attack really, really fast, like a flurry of dagger stabs, those you don't want them to have a lot of hit stun, so they had a very low modifier on top of that. Whereas the great hammer, which was a bit of a fan favorite for players, the hit stun on that would scale up kind of to comedically high numbers, where if you were dealing a lot of damage with a single swing of your great hammer, you could get like 30 entire frames of hit stun, which is basically a half a second where the screen is completely still because it's conveying how much of an impact that weapon had. And I think that added to the enjoyment of that weapon was feeling that impact with that massive hit stun. The other thing was hit effects. As you can see, the hit effects is comprised of two elements. One is a ring that starts out by expanding and then scales back in, and the other is a ring of vertical lines that's kind of spread out in a radial pattern. The only thing I'll say about that is, well, for starters, that's a particle system. That's how I decided to create that. I'm going to also have a sip of water. 1 second. So that's a particle system, and one of the things, I think one of the common mistakes I see when I see people creating hit stun or hit effects is that they'll leave certain settings in the particle system to default. And the one thing that I always kind of drives me up the wall as a default setting is how random particle systems are by default. And so with almost every particle system in the game, I always started by removing the randomness of where the particles spawn. So obviously this is being spawned in a burst, and if I didn't have the randomness disabled for how that burst spreads out, I would get these little lines kind of popping out. Sometimes they would all pop out in one direction, and like you'd get mostly just a bunch of sparks flying to the left or to the right. Because when you do random, that could happen. And you get this very uneven experience every single time. So I turned that off, so then now what you actually are seeing are these lines are coming out at exactly even angle intervals from one another, which gives you a very consistent and satisfying visual effect. But I still left the randomization of their start speed to have a little bit of range, as you can see how like some lines fly out faster and further, whereas other lines don't fly out as far. Finding that balance of like how much to randomize and how much not to randomize is a tricky thing, because if you make it too consistent, then it looks robotic. But if you make it too random, then you get just a lack of clarity in what you're trying to communicate. So that's like my immediate kind of learning from this slash lesson that I wanted to share was like lean on reliance a little bit. Don't have all things be random when it comes to effects like this. Sometimes just a good reliable effect is better than throwing random particles at the screen. A damage number popping up obviously is another big part of this. It serves, of course, a mechanical and game design purpose, but it also adds to the hit stun effect. To see these numbers pop off every time you hit is an important part of the experience. And one thing I wish I had captured in these GIFs as well is that I did a very subtle thing, which is that every time a damage number pops up, it always pops up basically like half a unit up from the point of impact and half a unit to left or right from the impact. And the left or right is just an alternating flag. Anytime a damage number pops up, the flag changes and says, go left this time, go right this time, go left this time. Again, it kind of comes back to that point of like, reliability creates clarity, and by having it always alternate left, right, it ensured that you quite rarely got overlapping damage numbers, so you could always read them, and more importantly, it didn't clutter the screen, so that reliably you always knew where you were going to see these, and you wouldn't have to worry about a damage number flying off in an unexpected direction, causing a clutter on the screen. And then the last bit of juice here that I want to talk about is the health bar. I'm all about highlighting change anywhere you can, and I highlight the change on the enemy's health because that's an important thing for the player to start to establish a mental model for, is how much is this changing by for each hit. Just by this one hit, by seeing that red outline, you can make a loose guesstimation in your head that this thing's going to die in 3 hits. If you whack an enemy and you just see a tiny sliver of red, that also communicates just how dangerous this enemy is, because now you know it's going to take a lot more hits to kill. That's far more effective than just immediately deleting that white part and just showing black. Now you get to see this red bit deplete over time. I also made a judgment call here to not do the same thing for the stance meter, which is the blue bar above the health bar. In the interest of basically like choosing my battles, the player's only able to really process a certain amount of visual information at a given time, and I decided that one was more important than the other. It's more important that you see the change in in health than it is that you see the change in stance. So I just made that decision. Um, so yeah, continuing along this train of thought about animation, I wanted to kind of do a bit of a deep dive into a specific enemy, and this is the enemy that was in the last GIF as well, which is the first enemy the player encounters, the guard. Um, so here you can see the animation going at normal speed. Here's the animation slowed down to by 1/6 basically, and at 60 frames per second, you're basically getting 1 frame per second here. Um, and this goes back to the principles of animation. You just want to have the core principles at show all the time. You want to have wind up. Here, tell is part of wind up as far as like an animation principle goes, but this is more of a gameplay purpose thing. You can see how after it pulls out the sword, it does one little like twist backward before the actual swing begins. I basically decided that like every enemy before a swing happens needs some type of lateral movement that is visible and lasts for a certain amount of time before the hitbox gets turned on. Something that the player can reliably visually notice and say, that's it, the attack's coming, I gotta get out of here. You can also see that like the hitbox enabling doesn't line up directly with the swing. There are a lot of cases where we fudged when the hitbox is and isn't enabled to, more often than not, err in the favor of the player. Players are quite often going to be more frustrated at an unearned hit rather than an unearned dodge. There are plenty of scenarios where just due to some bug or the other, like an enemy's attack is going to clip through you, and there were opportunities for us to fix some of those, and we decided that it was better that, hey, if we're going to have a bug, it's better that the bug is that they whiffed an attack that they should have gotten hit on rather than the other way around. So we always tried to err on the side of putting the hitboxes in the middle here. And I decided to also animate all this inside of Unity, partially because of the limitations that I mentioned before, which is the fact that I was the sole resource for animation, and the fact that these are all 2D objects. It's possible to very easily animate inside of Unity. I don't think I would have done this if we were doing a 3D game. I think that Blender's animation tools are far too powerful to not use when you're doing a 3D game, or whatever 3D animation software you decide to use. But Unity's animation system is more than powerful enough to do 2D animation with. And when you're making a game like this, where the animation and the gameplay are going to be so intrinsically tied together, being able to do it all inside one program and being able to visually see with markers inside your own editor exactly where something happens and then being able to tweak it on the fly was a godsend for really fast iteration. And then, as I mentioned before, again, you want to always have follow through and everything. Since these are just shapes, since these are just abstract shapes, the more that you can communicate about weight, the better. There's really, that's all you have to communicate character and personality is these little bits of motion, and you get that character through leaning into those principles of animation. So just as an example, I wanted to show like a more complex enemy attack animation. This is the Brute, which you face much later in the game, as you can tell by its much more intimidating design, as well as its far more complicated attack pattern. I'll come out and say it, this was just like directly inspired by Margit from Elden Ring, if you can't tell. Big club, and I'll show the other attack in a second, which is again very, very much inspired by Margit. Here, there's a couple of pieces that were used to be a little bit mean to the player, such as 2 fake outs. As you saw earlier, like we established from the first enemy that like, oh, if the weapon gets like pulled back a little bit, that means it's about to attack. That's another kind of just general learning about the animation in this game, by the way, is realizing how much your animation can be a part of the visual communication, the language of your game. Every enemy up until the every enemy up until the brute had this very similar tell of, okay, weapon got pulled back just a little bit more, attack is coming. And so it was really, really fun, and I mean fun as in evil, to then take that exact thing that we have visually communicated to this player thus far, and then do a fake out with it, where it pulls it back and then it doesn't quite swing just yet. Um, of course, how do you make sure that this is fun still? That's more of a game design question. And I think we mitigated it a little bit on account of the fact that the first time you face this boss, it's directly next to a checkpoint, so you can. Sorry, this isn't a boss, it's just a challenging enemy. The first time you face this enemy, it's right next to a checkpoint, so the player is allowed to learn from their mistakes very, very quickly. And beyond that, this and in general, most of the enemies don't have, relative to other Souls like, don't have that wide a range of attacks. They are fairly constrained in the number of attacks that we gave them. So I'm just justifying being mean, that's all. You can see here we have the two fake outs. This little yellow section here is the real tell. I think I justified having a very, relatively speaking, a very smaller true tell section of this compared to other enemies on account of the fact that A, this is late game, B, once you know it's fake out 1, fake out 2, then it swings. That's a fairly easy cadence to remember. You may also subtly notice that like the timing of this is almost to the beat. There's a very like familiar cadence to all these attacks that I tried to stick to, where it felt like these enemies were always attacking on a metronome, just to help kind of like make that stick in the player's mind better. And then of course this, instead of it just being a single attack, you can see it does 2 swings, and we have the hitbox turn on and off during those swings, so that it only, as far as the player is concerned, it only feels like the hitbox is on while the object is moving fast, because that conceptually makes sense. I also did not capture it in this GIF. I'm realizing I probably could have, but the hitboxes are not just tied to the object. The hitboxes kind of smear a little bit with the object, in the sense that they are a separate object animated on top of the weapon, and scales as necessary to fill in the amount of space that the object travels between frames. There are better like architectural ways to accomplish this in Unity if you take the time to properly investigate and implement them well. The reality is we did not have the time or the money or the resources to do it the right way. So we did it the way that we could in the time that we had, and it worked. This is the other attack that the enemy has. Darn it, I think I just put the same. Alright. Well, that's fine. You get to compare these two attacks. You can see the two attacks here. The thing I wanted to really kind of illustrate here is that we also used kind of like body language to try to communicate which attack is coming out. If this enemy pulls the club out from this left side, or relative to its body, its right side, then you know it's going to follow up with this dagger attack. If it pulls the club out from the other side, then it's going to do this little fake out attack. This is the closest thing to body language that exists in the context of our game. And the other thing that we did with the attacks in general, and this is true of all enemies, I just found it to be most noticeable with this enemy, was modulating tracking with, basically there's 2 types of tracking. There was positional tracking and rotational tracking. I decided to implement this through Unity events, so you can actually see these little lines here at the top of the timeline. Those are all the events with which I am modulating how much this enemy is tracking you at any given time. These are just events that then call a method in the code base of the enemy and tell the enemy, okay, stop tracking the player intensely. Basically, it would set a multiplier. It's like, start tracking the player at like 2x intensity. Now start tracking the player at 0.5 intensity. It also allowed us to do negative tracking, which was interesting in that sometimes an enemy's attack would be baked into, or we would bake into an enemy's attack a part of its attack where it would be designed to back away from you, or maybe even turn away from you to Whether it's to psych you out, whether it's to make the enemy intentionally miss for one reason or the other, it gave us a lot of control and kind of created this motion that you see here where the player is moving and doing this kind of dance around the enemy, and the enemy is chasing you in a way that feels natural and feels like they are also using the swings of their weapon to give themselves some position. Because you can't really get a sense of that here where the enemy's staying perfectly in place. But when you see it physically move around the space, you do benefit from that. The other thing I wanted to kind of briefly illustrate from this was the fact that the enemy sprite was animated as a child of the enemy, and the enemy's transform and its position was what the player was tracked onto. This was kind of like an emergent thing I didn't like intentionally do, but kind of decided was a good thing. Was the fact that that little dot that you see is the player's lock-on targeting reticule, and it created this interesting effect where by having the targeting reticule always centered on the root position of the enemy and letting the sprite of the enemy move around relative to that, it also helped sell the motion of the enemy a little bit better than if that dot had actually been following the sprite itself. Obviously, that's kind of subjective. That's what I felt. I had that kind of confirmed from some other players. But it's an interesting learning because it says something about kind of relative motion and secondary motion, which is another principle of animation. Um, but yeah, the other major thing that I had to do a lot of animation on was obviously all the weapons that the player could equip. So starting with the starting weapon, the most basic weapon is the sword that the player starts with. When you hit attack, you do a swing. I wanted the starting weapon to be as mind-numbingly simple to use as possible. From a game design and balance perspective, we may have made it a little bit too easy to use in that a lot of players didn't want to switch off of it because of how reliable it was. But as you can see, again, we're still following the principles of animation here. The difference in animating for the player versus animating for enemies is that you don't have to worry as much about communicating for the sake of the enemy. Like, you just what matters more is that the player feels like they pressed an input and the thing they're controlling reacted to their input. So having this wind up be as small as possible, which again, this comes to at 20 frames there, whereas this comes to 30 frames for this first enemy and 2 seconds in before the first attack comes out from this enemy, whereas here we are not even half a second in, or no, we are just no, we're at 60 frames per second, so we're not even half a second in, and we are already starting the swing. Because again, player hits input, the player wants to see their attack come out. And then we also try to keep the follow through relatively minimal, so that the player can follow up with attacks quickly and not feel like they're waiting forever. That all of this differs wildly from weapon to weapon, and that also had a direct impact on whether players liked weapons or not. Since launch, we spent a good bit of time just kind of playing with some of the less popular weapons, trying to figure out where we might have missed the mark on animation or balance, and it felt like a lot of the time it was animation, it was communication. But yeah, I don't feel like there's too much else to talk here, other than the fact that, once again, I'm animating the triangle along with a weapon. In one very early iteration of this, I was only animating the weapon so that I could just swap out the weapon and not have to figure out how to animate the player based off of the weapon they were holding. But when I added in player movement alongside the weapons, it gave the weapons so much more weight. You can see here, like, a really subtle thing that I tried to do in every attack animation was how the player leads the weapon before the weapon follows, which kind of adds to the weight of it a little bit. It makes it feel like the player is pulling this object that is heavier than itself to swing it around, in a way. And the other thing as well is every weapon had 4 animations basically for it. Originally, there was a plan to have like more combos and more things, but again, limited time, limited resources. It was nice to kind of just like draw a line in the sand and say, you know what, 4 animations per weapon. That way we can finish the game, and that way we can also make sure it's balanced. So what we had was a light attack two, a heavy attack charge, and a heavy attack. Um, and you can imagine how like this basically adds a multiplier of 4 onto any weapon that we come up with. Is we need to make sure that every weapon has at least this. There are some weapons that kind of broke this rule in some interesting ways, but if if they did, they usually added something rather than ever taking anything away. Um, but yeah, the heavy attack was also an interesting one because that's a type of attack that you can charge and hold. So the heavy attack charge is designed to be something that basically slowly pulls you into a pose that if you keep holding down the button keeps you in that pose for as long as the player has stamina to stay in that pose before releasing, and that all kind of fed into the way that I approached it as a creative direction of how to animate that movement. I also wanted to show like a very different kind of weapon just to kind of showcase the range of animation kind of problems I had to solve. The pickaxe was a really interesting one. Over time, I was starting to get really frustrated with how like every weapon was feeling like just a variation of swinging left to right and swinging right to left. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. And so I wanted to try something a little bit more ambitious, which was a weapon that had, at least as far as the player was concerned, an overhead swing. At least that's what it was meant to look like. Um, and this was a fun challenge, just trying to figure out like how to communicate this. We technically were using a 3D camera in Void Souls, and I could have broken the rules and just straight up animated this thing going over the player, but I felt like it would have looked a little bit too out of place compared to every other weapon to do that. So instead, I basically, for the pickaxe, I made two pieces of art. One piece of art for the pickaxe that is the default view, which is on its side, a side view of it, and then one where it was kind of rotated, which, as far as like the art asset goes itself, you can see it here in slow motion, where really it's not that complicated piece of art. The real thing that I think that sells this is the animation and the effects. It's also worth noting that like mechanically this pickaxe functions differently than other weapons in that it has a relatively small hitbox and as well as a sweet spot where as long as you hit enemies in the sweet spot it deals more damage. So all of that needed to be communicated with this motion and this hit effect. And this is the first example of a weapon that was, nope, I take that back. The Great Hammer did it first, but like this was a very different kind of impact that we were trying to sell. So once again, you can see this is a little bit more random of a particle system than before, but I still removed the default randomness of the particle spawn to make sure that this particle effect that it spawned always created this nice and visually pleasing spread. But yeah, which then brings us to bosses. So Immaculate was a boss. Spoiler alerts, it is a bit of a later game boss, but I'm interested in talking about it, so here we are. This was this was a boss that some folks had some strong opinions about at launch. We've kind of iterated on it since then, but it is basically the closest thing to a Malenia type boss that we have, which is it's just a boss that it's designed to be a bit of a difficulty spike. It's designed to be a bit of a skill check, and it is also meant to keep attacking the player and help and until the player learns where its combos end. And so the real challenge with animating this was creating and animating attacks that read as combos, as well as this, which, sorry, spoiler alert, there's a phase 2, where it becomes corrupted and all its attacks, and it has a whole new suite of attacks that reflect its more corrupted state. Whereas the first state is all about this boss attacking kind of synchronized to the metronome of the music in the background, kind of on a beat and very like perfectly. Its second phase is the antithesis of that, where it is just wildly swinging with rage and fury. So there were a lot of challenges to animating this boss. But the one that I'm going to try to focus on here is, if there we go, is the combo system. This overlaps a little bit with programming more so than animation truly, but I also wanted to showcase like this had the most animations out of any boss. Each of those animations was toiled over for a long time trying to find the right balance of visually interesting attacks that look threatening but aren't completely BS to dodge. Um, but the way that it was implemented, I was pretty proud of the solution that I came up with. Basically, I came up with three poses that the boss can be in: swords down, swords front, and swords up. The down, front, and up are relative. These are named weird. Don't worry about that part. The point is, they're just three different poses. And anytime that the boss decides that it's about to do an attack, it would pick an attack based off of out of the attacks it has done. It would try to pick an attack it hasn't done as often, just so that it switches up its tactics often. Um, and then when it would pick that attack, it would look up what its starting pose is. It's worth noting I did not use Animator State Machine for anything in this game. It is all just instantaneously like setting things to animations, which is a pretty common practice when it comes to 2D games. Oftentimes, the animator state machine system in Unity will fight you when you're trying to do 2D animations versus when you're doing 3D. It's very helpful, but not in 2D. So I kind of had to implement my own mini state machine system here, where the boss would decide, okay, I want to do this swords up to front attack. That means I need to start in pose swords up, and this animation pose swords up takes the boss from its idle state into its swords up pose. Then it plays the swords up to front animation, which ends in the swords front animation. And then I had a variety of complicated logic that decided how many more attacks the boss is going to do in sequence before it would end with a finisher. So there would be a chance that this was the only attack it was going to do, and it's going to do a finisher right after. So it would say, cool, I ended in swords front. How many finishers do I have with swords front? This one. So I'm going to do this animation next. And that was kind of how I chained together these animations. To kind of illustrate in a bit of a video here, which is super low quality. The heck? Okay, that's fine, I guess. You can see here that this is like that first animation that puts the boss into a pose. In this case, this is swords down. And then it's going to pick the next attack. In this scenario, it's going to do down to up. So it starts at down, it does its attack, which has this kind of two swing thing, and it ends in the up pose. And then it's going to pick the up finisher, which means it's going to start at up and then do this double swing poke forward attack and then put its weapons away. Which, again, that was another thing that like we decided throughout the game was a very important part of visual communication, was the fact that you could mostly reliably know that, hey, if the enemy just put its weapons away, it's your turn. Which is more than can be said for some bosses in Elden Ring. Next slide, please. Come on, Google. On the other end of the spectrum, of a very different kind of enemy, was the worm, a boss, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a giant worm. This boss is procedurally animated, partially. The head was traditionally animated. As you can see, it's nothing complicated. It's basically just a center piece and then two jaws that open in and out. The rest of the body is all procedurally animated with the exception of one attack, which is its spin attack, which it does now, where I actually interpolate from its procedurally animated components into a traditionally... Actually, sorry, no, it is still procedural, but it has to switch between two procedural states. One where it is controlled by constraints that I coded, and one where it is in a coroutine, where you can see I didn't quite get it perfect, so there are some instances where that interpolation breaks. And so that whole animation that it does right there is basically just a coroutine with a complicated formula that moves all the pieces of the body perfectly such that it creates this big swing. And then once it's done with that, it interpolates back into its procedural state. So what do I mean by the procedural part of it, where these body parts all kind of move together? Well, this video, which if people want, I can share this link in the chat just so people can like bookmark it or whatever. This was a great video in terms of just like visually explaining the fundamentals of procedural animation. In this scenario, I use this almost exactly as they described in this tutorial slash explanation. But what I love about this video is how well it explained the fundamentals, which can be applied to a wide range of procedural animation. But I won't belabor this point too much because, again, this video does such a phenomenal job of explaining it. Which brings us to the second deep dive, which I'm going to try to pick up the pace here because we're coming up on an hour. This is the script that is attached to 90% of the enemies in the game. Basic approach flee.cs. And this controls 90% of how enemies behave in the game. I was genuinely surprised by how much mileage I got out of a single enemy behavioral script. So let me explain to you how this works. The enemy has the enemy has a variety of major states, basically an idle state, a follow state, and an attack state, basically. Idle is what it sounds like. The enemy is just sitting around waiting for the player to come up and fight him. And attack is exactly what it sounds like. The enemy is inside of an attack animation, so it's going to just do that animation and do whatever code is necessary to properly handle the data for that animation. Follow state is where a lot of quote-unquote the magic happens. I think there was a lot of positive reception to the way that enemies moved and the way that they fought players, insofar as it made the fights feel like a dance, which is something you always want to go for in a Souls-like, is you want the fight to feel like a back and forth motion. And so I wish I could better describe how I came to this conclusion, but as with most things that I work on, these things just kind of come as a result of a lot of iteration. And where I landed that I felt worked really well was 3 core sub-states when the enemy is trying to follow you. The enemy is either fleeing you because you're too close, or the enemy is strafing because it is at the right range, or the enemy is approaching you because you're too far. These ranges were determined by basically getting the minimum and maximum. So for our enemy data, basically we had this data structure called attack data, and each animation was paired with some information about where these attacks are best meant to be used. So this attack, called double attack, is best meant to be used within 2 to 4 units of its target. So if there was another attack that had a bigger range on the same enemy, like there were some enemies that could do both melee and ranged attacks, so their ranges would be really, really big. But it would basically use these values to best determine where to set these boundaries relative to the player. That's, by the way, that's player and enemy. So it would use these values to determine where these ranges are, relatively speaking, whether it's too close, whether it's in the right range, or whether it's too far. And the other key thing that I would do to try to make sure that the movement felt as natural as possible was that each state, or each of these sub-states, had a minimum time to stay in them. I think a common mistake I see in a lot of other kind of either hobbyist or indie enemy implementations is that these states are so rigidly defined that enemies will get caught in moments where they are perfectly between 2 states and just kind of jitter or not be sure about what state to be in and just kind of behave odd. I found it far more consistent to just say, right now this enemy is in this state. No matter what happens, the enemy should try to stay in this state for at least this long. There were certain cases that would like immediately force it to break out of that state. Obviously, if the player stunned the enemy or if the enemy lost LOS, losing and gaining line of sight on the player was a very common trigger to switch the enemy's state entirely, because that's a very clear indication for the player to know that they've lost line of sight. But at the core of it, this is really it. I'm too close, I need to back off. I'm at the right range, I'm going to strafe around the player. I'm too far, I need to get closer. And that created 90% of what players enjoyed about the enemy AI. Boss AI, on the other hand, every boss had a completely bespoke combo system. Every boss had a completely bespoke phases and music handling system. And every boss had completely bespoke movement. The pros of this was that a lot of our reviews positively mention the bosses and how unique each boss felt. By kind of forcing myself to implement each boss completely bespoke, it made me far more keen to just throw everything out every time I started on a new boss and just start with what sounds fun, what seems thematically appropriate here. The downside, however, are the endless number of Jira tickets that we got about bosses behaving weirdly in unique scenarios. For instance, snare traps and caltrips not working on the final boss, because the final boss has its own bespoke movement system, and when you have bespoke systems over and over and over again, you're not going to implement them exactly the same every time, and therefore the Zenith boss is not affected properly by getting slowed. So there's benefits and downsides to this. There's definitely better ways to architect this. This is also, once again, a byproduct of limited time and resources. But you can see here, this is an example of like the code for how the warden attacks, where it's just a lot of really bespoke if-else statements. I also tried to be, we learned kind of right around launch at the very last minute how important it was for for boss attack specifically, to be as non-random, was a better word for that, than as possible. Like, as obviously it's predictable, but like as much as possible, players should be able to learn a full attack pattern reliably, especially in the kind of game that we're trying to make. And so you can see here, these are all very if this then that, if this then that, do this and then do that, with little to no random numbers at all. How did I approach like animating or sorry, designing these enemy AIs? So my design philosophy for enemy AI was, in an ideal state, you always want to start with a clear definition of how something should behave. You also want to follow the fun, so like you got to find a middle ground between creating a strict definition of how an enemy should behave versus letting yourself experiment. And one of the key things that really helps with this is a ton of exposed variables. You can see here, these are all the variables that we had exposed for every single enemy that could move. And with this, we were able to create the vast majority of enemy movement behaviors. I like to also try to like start with emotion first in terms of enemy AI. Like, it helps give you a guiding purpose for how an enemy behaves. As an example, like I hadn't really kind of established that for the first few enemies, the guards and the jailers that you face in the first area, because they were the first enemies and we didn't really know what we were doing yet, and I was just trying to get the game to work. But once we reached the forest and onward, every enemy's AI started with a loose definition of its mood or its emotion or its personality. Maybe personality would be a better word here. But as an example, one of my favorite enemy types is the poacher. Sorry, that's the boss. The trapper, which are the enemies you encounter in the forest that, as the name implies, throw traps at you. And the word I wrote down for the trapper was cowardly. And from there spawned the movement of this enemy. If this enemy is cowardly, it's going to flee more often than it's going to approach. If this enemy is cowardly, it's only going to try to attack you when you're trapped. If this enemy is cowardly, it's going to try to stay close to other trappers. Like, a single personality trait can have a massive range of effects on how you code something. And I think it's really important that someone on a team should be defining these things so that you're designing towards a goal when it comes to enemy AI. Because enemy AI, sure, it needs to serve the gameplay, but it's not going to feel like AI if it's just following a rigid set of instructions. So having a personality trait or an emotion to lean on is going to help you a lot there. You also want to try to exhaust your design space. I think a common mistake I see from other indies and hobbyists in making indie games is to to do what I did with bosses and just to make a bunch of bespoke things over and over again. Thankfully, we didn't do that with enemies too much, and relatively speaking, enemies all work very closely the same. And there was we were starting to implement the wolf enemies, and I originally started with a bespoke script for the wolf because I was like, I want this enemy to like strafe around the player and do this complex stuff, and I was like, yeah, no, that's not going to work with the existing code base, so I'm going to start with something new. And then I went back to the original behavior and realized that by exposing just a few more variables, I was able to create the far more unique movement system of the wolf out of the existing script of all the other enemies without changing a line of code, just by being a little bit more creative with how many variables I exposed. Most notably for the wolf, the strafe speed multiplier, so that the wolf speed strafes faster, and the too close distance, which is just an overriding global modifier to how close an enemy is willing to get to you. The minimum flee time, and like all these variables, just by tweaking them, I was able to create this enemy that got up in your face and then tried to like just disorient you by spinning around you very quickly and then going in for a bite. And that did not require any new piece of code. Um, on the other end of the spectrum, we had this idea for an enemy that was basically like a mind control type enemy called the Confessor, which was part of an entire system which loosely exists in the game. It's not implemented at a high level. It's implemented on a per basis level, which is questionable at best. But basically, there is a faction system in the game where certain enemies will be hostile to each other by default. And we thought it would be interesting to have an enemy that was kind of like a mind controlling type enemy who would cause factions that are normally hostile to one another to become friendly with each other and team up on you. But if you killed this enemy, those enemies would go back to being hostile against one another. The learning from this was that a lot of players never realized there was a faction system at all. A lot of players just saw some enemies fight sometimes and they were like, huh, those guys don't like each other. All right, whatever. And we discovered this thankfully during playtesting, not after we released. And we realized that like when you're designing enemy AI, you know how this thing behaves. You know all of its complexity. I think a really great example that I've heard over and over again is about these enemies. I want to say it's from Spec Ops: The Line, and also the enemies from no, the name of the game has escaped me. There's another game as well where basically like having enemies call out what they're going to do or call out the bare bone basic stuff that the game knows is going on. Like if the player goes and takes cover behind a wall and then the enemy says, "They're taking cover, flank them." That sounds incredibly smart. Thank you. Yes, fear, and Half-Life does it a little bit as well. It sounds incredibly smart when an enemy does that, right? We had a really smart enemy going here, like, in terms of like what we coded and what was working under the hood. What it was doing, so smart. As far as playtesting revealed, no one understood it. No one gave a shit. They just killed it, and then moved on with their day. No matter how much we tried to kind of make these encounters lean into this idea, it just wasn't working because at the end of the day, the only thing the player cares about is what they know the enemy thinks it knows. And this basically just ended up turning into a healer type enemy. Anyways, I'm going to try to move this along. Game design. This is a bit more kind of touchy-feely, big picture-y type stuff than anything too specific, but some learnings about game design on this project. It's easier to iterate than it is to generate. When we started, this was actually pulled directly from our pitch deck, this image right over here. I don't know what the heck this is. There's definitely some semblance between this and what we launched with, but this was just like a random sketch I threw together in Photoshop so that I could convey that we have some idea of a plan for this game. Um, I remember spending a lot of time really toiling over trying to figure out what this game was going to look like and how this game was going to connect it together and what the big picture was going to be. At the end of the day, the only thing that got us to what we launched with, which is what you see here on the right, um, was making it just bit by bit, seeing how it fit together, and making it good from there. Which is another statement that Nick helped me write here was make it exist, make it make sense, then make it good. There's a lot of like pressure sometimes to start by making sure you have a good plan and then working on it. So the thing that I'll always say to myself is just if I don't know how to make it good, I'm just gonna do it bad. It's better to do it bad because once you know what you're looking at, you can iterate on it. Prior to that, it's all in your head. It's all in theory. You could iterate on it forever. You have no idea if it's going to work. But once you see it and you can point to it and say that's bad, you can also better identify why that's bad. Otherwise, you're just guessing. It also allows you to pivot early. It allows you to pivot often. If you are too focused on trying to make something good from the start and don't give yourself the time to just say, hey, you know what? I threw something together and it was bad. I can give up on it real quick. There's a lot less heartache over that compared to pouring a ton of time and effort into making something that you think is going to be really good and then being crushed when inevitably your implementation isn't as good as it sounded like. Another learning about game design on this project, I am generally a fan of spreadsheets and tables, and I usually use them pretty often. Originally, I started out, again, similar to my learning from before, by trying to design from spreadsheets first. And that did not work at all, where I was trying to start with a spreadsheet to determine what these values should be. Instead, I ended up doing it the other way around, which was start with a number. I'd say, like, I'm putting together this new katana weapon. I'm just going to, like, say this katana deals a base damage of 20. Let me just start there and start playing with it and see if that feels fun. I play with it, and then I pull out the sword, and then I play with that. And then I get a kind of a loose emotional take on it. But once I've gotten the emotional take down, eventually you do have to figure out how these numbers are going to work when you have much deeper systems, like a leveling system and an upgrade system. So that's when I do this approach of just taking the numbers from the game and putting them into tables and then trying shit. And I really mean that in the most literal sense possible. I have no plan whatsoever when I put these numbers into a spreadsheet. I just put them in and then just start trying things. Over here you can see this is me balancing, or at least trying to balance, the potion ingredient system. And by putting all the data that I had just initially thrown in at random, and then just trying things like, oh, what happens if I select only these ingredients? What happens if I select these ones? And then just like letting the spreadsheet add up these numbers. And then I was like, oh, let me use Google Sheets to like highlight numbers that are positive versus negative. Let me just do that and see what happens. Just by doing that, I was able to immediately see some things that just stick out like sore thumbs. Similarly here, like the katana, the DPS for the katana was a stickler for us for a long time, and I again I threw all these things into a spreadsheet. I started in this case I graphed it. I wish I'd included the graph here, but I just graphed it and then looked at how two different graphs compared and then sort of made a judgment call based off of that. The other side effect of graphing things is that sometimes you accidentally end up making a smoke test QA spreadsheet, which is actually what you're looking at here. This originally started out as a way for me to kind of scope out where and how often players find items. And then I was like, you know what? Let me expand on this. And then I made some more, and I was like, oh, look at that. This is a really useful smoke test checklist. And it can also help you with the level design. Early on, while Nick and I were still trying to figure out the flow of the game, I can't remember if Nick made any of these, but I made a bunch of these, and I shared them with Nick to try to help us kind of align on the design space that we were working with. where I wanted to map out sort of pacing and like where we're placing items, where we're placing encounters, and even if you don't use something like this long term, even if it's only helpful just to illustrate an idea, I found something like this super helpful for giving Nick and I a vocabulary to discuss with. It gave me as well, like, because as a creative director, I had to just tell Nick, hey, here's the space that you have, and here's how many items you can place here, and here's how much encounters we should have. And it helped me to have some like baseline stuff to look back on and say, okay, well, when I designed this space, we had this many options at this many junctions where the player had to decide where to go. And then when we did that area, there were this many junctions. Maybe this area felt too linear because there weren't enough, or maybe this area felt confusing because there were too many. So sometimes you don't have to have a goal when you start to put something like this together. By virtue of putting it together, you're going to uncover new perspectives on it. And I think the last-ish thing about game design here is this is more just kind of pragmatic advice. If you have one of a thing, hard code it. If you have two of a thing, copy and paste it. I'm sure I'm sure Eric is just like breathing very heavily right now. But if you have three of a thing, maybe make a bit of a copy and paste pipeline. If you start to get four or more, start to work on an infrastructure for it. Don't start on that infrastructure first. Get it working first. You don't even know if the thing that you're making is going to be fun yet. You don't even know if you're going to want it yet. And if you start with that infrastructure, you're going to spend a lot of time on that without knowing if it's even what you want yet. Now, at some point, you have to, cross that threshold, and if you truly take this 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order, you're going to end up with a lot of time spent refactoring code, and that's going to suck. So you have to pick your battles, and you have to know when's the right time to do it. But you can see here, like, there's quite a few, like, enemy and boss scripts that were in this thing. At the end of the day, it was done. It worked. We had a lot of bugs, and we had to fix them, and we probably could have fixed them better if we knew what if we had a better infrastructure from the start. But we also didn't know every enemy we were making at the start, so there was no way to make an infrastructure until we know what's fun. For this slide, I couldn't find any good like reference material or images to show, but just some notes / thoughts on balance. Do as many blind playtests as you can. What I mean by blind in this scenario is someone who is not on your development team, someone who has not seen anything about it yet, preferably someone who is in your target audience, but most importantly, someone who hasn't touched it yet. At every stage of development, you want to make sure you have some people who have been, quote-unquote, reserved for this purpose. One of our friends, Jonathan, came in at a critical moment near launch as someone who was in our audience and someone who had not touched the game at all for the, 2.5 years we've been working on it, came in basically like a month or two before launch and play tested it completely blind from beginning to end, and we got so much data, so much more data from that playtest than we did as we were getting diminishing returns from playtests with other close friends who had been playing it a ton. You benefit from both, by all means. It's also helpful to have people who have seen the evolution of the game so that they can also help make sure you're moving in the right direction. But also make sure you have some friends and some trusted playtesters who are ready to test your thing from beginning to end as if they've never seen it before. And when you're watching that playtest, it's really far more important to watch, don't listen. Even if you have a well-renowned game designer playtesting your game, giving you really good feedback on your game, they are not you. They don't know what it is you're trying to make. And no matter what they say, what's more important is what they do when they play, which is what I mean by watch, don't listen. Players are far more revealing, especially if you can do this like an in-person playtest and watch their face, because faces, relatively speaking, don't lie about their emotions. If you're doing it online on a Discord call, you can just ask whoever's playtesting to just stream of consciousness say whatever it is they're thinking. And if they're not doing that, sometimes you can just prompt them and say, like, so what are you trying to do right now? So where are you trying to go right now? So, and try not to lead the witness with those questions too much. Don't try not to be too much like, so did you think that boss was BS or what? Like, be more just like, Okay, and how did you feel about that boss fight? As often as you can throughout the experience, because the more kind of visceral, immediate reactions you're getting, the better. And focus on those feelings that they're expressing, not just, again, what they say or what they convey, because there's always a bit of information lost between how a player feels about an experience and what they say about their experience. And there's also information lost between what they say and how you interpret what they say. The most direct feedback you can get is watching their face, listening to the way that they talk about the experience, and getting a beat on their feelings about the experience more so than just you should completely change this one weapon and make it do double damage or something like that. Like that's good feedback, but why are they saying that? Why do they feel that's important? Okay, last deep dive. Creative direction. Don't think outside the box. Think inside the box. A lot of this is going to be a very pragmatic advice. Something you'll learn about me is I'm a very pragmatic game developer in a lot of ways. When you're making a game, players don't know what's in the box, if this metaphor for a box is your game. Aside from genre convention and whatever you may have put out in terms of marketing material, players don't know what they're about to play. You do, and sometimes that, as a creative director slash person who's deciding what's getting put into this game, can make you feel like you got to keep adding things that are outside the box. You got to keep doing something different, keep doing something weirder. But players don't know what's in the box. Players don't know how big this box is yet. And it really helps to take a step back and look at, okay, what is the size of the box we've constructed? We've made a top-down 2D Souls-like. Before we go coming up with this weird, crazy idea that breaks the mold of anything they've seen so far, have we thoroughly explored everything within a 2D top-down Souls-like yet? Or are we about to just break our own rules for no good reason? And this kind of thinking is what helps you develop more small, dense boxes rather than big, empty boxes. I've we as a team have learned this lesson over and over with every game that like players much prefer denser experiences. If your game is like there's obviously exceptions to every rule, but like generally speaking, it's not particularly fun to pick up a game and find an experience that is wide as the ocean but deep as a puddle. Um, and this kind of goes back to the playtesting thing. Like every new player seeing this box for the first time, you as a player are going to you as a designer are going to constantly feel like this isn't interesting enough. We got to push this a little bit harder. But that's not necessarily always the case for the player, because the player is always going to see it for the first time when they play it, and everything's going to be brand new to them. And last, most importantly, how much time and money do you have to make the box? A box is not a box if you don't have 6 sides. You can't launch your game if you're just missing an entire side to your box. So the important thing is that you have a box more than you have a really big one. Another thing about creative direction, some stuff I learned. This is bog standard, basic stuff, I feel like, but it bears repeating. Compliment sandwiches. When you're working with creatives, everyone's pouring a little bit of their soul into everything they make. And the truth is, you got to be conscious of people's feelings. And it really, really helps to do a standard compliment sandwich. You may not like something that someone has made at all. It may not vibe with your vision in the slightest. But you got to compliment sandwich it, because in theory, you've hired and or you're working with someone who is doing their best and tried hard on something. And you want to make sure you reflect that. You want to show that, hey, I respect the work and the time and effort that you did in this. However, I don't think this is the kind of thing that we're going to do, but I appreciate what you did. Now let's try something else. It's also important to have accountability. Most often, I see this as an issue in terms of leadership from creative directors who don't want to take accountability. As a creative director, you're going to make bad calls from time to time. You're gonna mess up on pointing the team in the wrong direction, on shooting down an idea that was good and having to go back on them. And it is just so gosh darn important that you, as the person who the team views as a creative director, to acknowledge that from time to time, to say, you know what, I think I made the wrong call here, so that it just conveys a sense of trust between everybody. It's also important as a creative director to make sure that whatever it is you're working on has a shared vision. there's this wonderful example, this strange and mysterious horn structure that Miranda made. The story for this is so weird. I think Nick was doing some level design research for an area by looking at D&D maps of like castle towns, and one of the castle towns that he looked at had this art of this very large horn that looked like kind of like a warning horn, basically. And then he was just kind of showing off his process during one of our meetings to show, hey, here's some of the things I looked at. Miranda got a glance at that horn, was just like, I love that. I don't know what that is, but I love that. And she wanted to do something with that. And I was just like, in my head, I had no idea what we were going to do with this. I had no idea where it was going to go in the game. I had no idea what it was mechanically going to do yet. But I could tell Miranda and everyone else on the call who was there for that felt very strongly, this is interesting. We should just do it. And sometimes it's more important that you share the vision of what you're making than it is to only do what's in your head. And by gosh, did this work out, because this is one of my favorite pieces of assets in the entire game. It's just so strange and unexpected, and it did create a wonderful experience for some players in our Void Souls Discord, that when they encountered it, they were all trying to figure out what it did. We made the mistake of adding an Easter egg interaction to it that just makes a noise and then does nothing, which also drove people a little bit insane. So there were some other learnings there, but all in all, you benefit from sharing your vision with the team. You benefit from letting other people on your team cook. Being the leader of a team does not mean you're the best at everything. It just means that you're pointing the team in a direction. Void Souls benefits from the fact that I'm not the best at everything. It benefits from the fact that everybody gets to cook from their own personal tastes and flavors. Yeah, trust, time and money, pragmatism, you get it. This is, I think, the last thing about creative direction. So steering the ship, I think there are certainly some creative directors out there that are like, I don't know, auteurs who know exactly what it is they're making from the moment they set out to make it. I am not that kind of creative director, and I'm sure there are plenty of others like me out there. This is what it feels like for me to creative direct a game. Is I feel like I am rowing a boat with everybody on this boat looking at me while I say, "Yep, go forward. Yep, go forward," and we're just rowing through a thick fog of game development, where things are changing on the fly, where we are running into problems, where things aren't working out, and we're constantly just like, okay, I guess we got to go left. Okay, I guess we got to go right. And then sometimes there are those really scary moments where you're just saying, "Hey, folks, I know we've been going north this entire time. I I really feel like we need to steer west a bit. I don't know why. Just trust me. I feel like we need to go west." And you don't know if that's going to be right. I've also heard this kind of process described as a search algorithm, which I think is a really clever metaphor. Because it really is. It's, you don't know how this thing is going to be received at the end. You don't know what the finished product is going to be like until it's all together. And it's really important that you, as a creative director, are doing so. You have to course correct. It's important that you course correct in a healthy and productive manner. There are so many studios out there right now that have gone through a lot of crunch because they course correct in the most destructive ways possible. And there's really no good, one size fits all for this. You gotta know when and why you're course correcting, and make sure you do so in a way that mitigates wasted effort as well as team morale. People are not gonna be happy when you say, "Hey, we gotta course correct." And again, once again, pragmatism, time and money, all the stuff costs time and money, and you don't have infinite number of that. Okay, parting thoughts. It's better to have finished the game than to have never finished the game. Do your reps, make things often, and finish those things. If you want to be a heavyweight lifter, you don't start by trying to lift a massive weight as your first thing and then hope that by lifting it for very long, you'll eventually heave it over your head. It's just not going to happen. You get there by lifting small weights over and over and over and over until you develop the muscles to lift the bigger weights. Another great metaphor is building pyramids. If you know what? I'm sick of metaphors. I think I've belabored this point enough. finish things, please. For the love of God, finish games. If you want to make games, finish games. Uh, Humble brag, we have had just wonderful positive reception for this game, and I couldn't be more happy with how people have appreciated it. It's so cool getting to see people like Yahtzee play the game and just reading all these great reviews from people who've played it for 53 hours. And to have a Metacritic review is the first time that we've had a Metacritic review for our game, which is crazy. Um, just surreal getting to like open so many different articles from established newspapers that have written about the game. Um, yeah, that's I tried to wrap it up before we nearly hit 2 hours, so apologies if I felt a little bit rushed at the end there. I'm now open to some question and answers, and I was going to use this fancy Q&A system that they have, but I'm just going to let like answer questions from Discord chat here off to the side. My favorite color is usually purple. Finish it. It's finished. Did I make the 1, 2, 3, 4 infrastructure thing? Yes. Uh, I uh, I didn't find this written anywhere else. Um, so in a sense, yes, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone else has a similar kind of frame of thinking. What's next? Can't say yet. We're still figuring that out at the moment, to be honest. Turns out that launching a game takes a lot out of you, and it takes a minute to kind of find your footing and figure out what you're doing next. We want to keep working on Void Souls. We'll see if it's in the cards. Any tips or lessons learned from the dynamic audio in boss battles? Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Tips or lessons? We spent the longest amount of time we spent on a boss was the first boss, just trying to get the format slash system right. Um, so I mean, like first lesson in general is if you're going to do something like music that changes with the phase of the boss, make sure that you have a tested working example of that first, so that you can replicate that success again. Um, Otherwise, you're gonna have a bad time because that first time was pretty rough, to be honest. It took Vivi and I quite a few iterations until we got it working the way we wanted. But once we did, it was much easier to replicate that after that. Um, Other than that, I can't really talk too much about like just kind of audio balance or even composing, of course, because that is not my area of expertise in the slightest. Um, but it was yeah, that's all I got on that one, honestly. What did I enjoy better, self-publishing or working with the publisher? Those are two entirely different experiences. That is apples to oranges, honestly. It depends on where you are in your life and what it is you're trying to accomplish. Working with a publisher means you have money, and it means that you get to pay not only yourself but your friends to work with you. Um, Working by yourself means that you don't have to be beholden to anyone else's schedule. You don't have to kind of be, um, I don't know. There's a lot less overhead. There's a lot less people to share your creative vision with. Um, but it also means you don't have money. So it's a give and a take at the end of the day. Mentioned that some attacks would be on cue with the rhythm. Is there a system driving that, or was it just a matter of trying to design the timing in mind? Yeah, it wasn't a hard system that was just like, okay, here's the BPM of the music, and we're going to always make sure the attack happens here. It was more so that when I would design a boss and its animations, I would make sure that those components of an animation, like the wind up, the swing, and the follow through for a given boss, would all try to be roughly the same from attack to an attack. And if an attack would break the rules, that it would try to break the rules inconsistent ways again, because it's all about rhythm. All right, several people are typing. We got some questions coming in. Do you have a set number of enemies you want to design in the game? Uh, yes. We did not hit that. In general, we had a set number of areas, we had a set number of weapons, we had a set number of upgrades, of everything at the very start. We had a set number of all of the above, and we did not have enough time and resources to hit the mark on any of those. Um, yeah, Eric designed a really cool enemy that did not make the final cut at the end of the day. We used to have RNG cooldown between attack patterns. Yeah, it was right before launch, basically. We had a last minute change. We were just like, the cooldown between attack patterns is a little bit random right now, and that's messing with that rhythm that I mentioned, so we need to remove that ASAP. Were there any cool weapon or enemy ideas that had to be dropped? Um, yes, there were. I mean, there were so many between the millions of ideas that we had and the million. There were literally thousands of ideas that we had. There were maybe like 5 to 10 different items and enemies that we implemented that didn't make the final cut. Um, I can't really talk too much about them in case they do end up making the cut, and this video is getting posted online, and I want to keep those a surprise. Um, at what point did you decide to force the animations to trigger via code, and did I like the result? So you're talking about the Unity animation events, is that right, Arcane? Okay. Um, this is something that I'd done before, and actually, counterintuitively, I didn't like using these before, and was kind of scared to use them again. Um, and I really wanted to actually do my own system for them because historically I had run into issues where sometimes those events wouldn't trigger. What I will say is, as far as I'm aware, I don't feel like we ran into that issue at all. I'm not sure if it's something that Unity fixed as of we were using 2022 for this game. So I'm not sure if it's something that they fixed in that version onwards, but I was genuinely kind of surprised at the fact that I never felt like we had a single dropped animation event. It's also possible that it's worth noting that like very few animation events here are gameplay critical, so it's possible that sometimes that issue still exists. But most of the time, these animation events were used to just kind of control small aspects of movement, or basically, it was very heavily mitigated what control we gave to animation events. And so it's possible that that's why I haven't noticed any issues. The other thing that we did as well was that basically, like, any data that could be changed by an animation event from an animation, or any event that could be called from an animation, we would also have a safeguard such that anytime that an animation event ended, we generally knew what state the variables were supposed to be in, and we would try to like just reset them in case something weird happened in the animation. So we went with them because they are easy to use and they are there and they, for the most part, work. I knew that they come with some potential issues, and we did what we could to mitigate them. And as far as I'm aware, we just did not have issues with them somehow. Um, I really liked the make it bad part and the general idea openness to left turns, also the different incarnations of the map that you showed. Lots of food for thought. Um, how do you strike a balance between having confidence in your design slash pre-GDD with a singular vision versus knowing that you are likely to change things, perhaps even fundamental things? That's a really good question. I should have taken a sip of water before this. Hang on. How do you strike a balance between having confidence in your design pre-GDD with a singular vision versus knowing? That's a tricky question on account of the fact that I think I'm just not that kind of designer. Um, I, for better or worse, the kind of designer that I am is a kind of person who my head looks like this cloud. The cloud has a loose shape, and I think I know what it looks like. Um, but I am not that kind of person who, like, when I start a project, I'm like, it's gonna have this, it's gonna have that. I really like the publisher. Talking to the publisher was almost like having a helpful gun to my head to force me to make something like this. I would not on my own make something like this if we were not pitching this game, but we needed something to show them that we knew what we were doing, that we had some semblance of a plan. 9 times out of 10 that plan is a fuzzy image in my head for better or worse. Um and I feel like by writing it down, it helped a little bit in that it helped other people on my team and on obviously the publisher's team to better understand my vision. And even they were very understanding as I slowly kind of iterated on these things like this. And they saw, like, uh, as long as they were kept in the loop that, like, hey, we're changing this and this is why, hey, we're changing this and this is why, as long as we did stuff like that, they always understood why things were changing. Um, so most of the stuff was really for the benefit of others and for the team to know where we are, what we're doing. But I, as a creative designer, I I start with no confidence in my pre-GGD. I start with the assumption that next to nothing is a guarantee. The only thing that I try to do as both a creative director and a team leader is to just be conscious of when and where we are course correcting and to mitigate that as much as possible to ensure that no one on the team gets burnt out, frustrated, or just, upset. There are some times where we just have to say, like, there's to this day, there are things about Void Souls that we're just like, yep, we could have designed that better. I wish we had designed that better. But course correcting on that at the time of development that we were at just wasn't worth it. It was better for us to focus on what was almost good and make it great rather than to try to go back and redesign something that's at best going to be a minor annoyance for players. Um, when negotiating with your publisher, did they ever express the particular aspects that they would like to want to pursue? Did they ever share concerns or caution against anything? Yes, all of the above. I think, as with any good creative relationship, they were fairly communicative if there was anything that we were doing that they were concerned about or felt that needed improvement. And the nice thing was that we reached a good agreement in which we were just given a lot of trust, thankfully, and it was very helpful to be able to. I say do what we wanted to, but it was very much a collaboration in the sense that we said, hey, we want to do this, and he does that, and it helps to have that kind of like line in the sand where we didn't really kind of get in their business too much with sales and marketing. They didn't get in our business too much with creative direction, and yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that question. You ever struggle with optimization? Well, it's better that Eric answered that question because Eric did a lot of the optimizing work. But I will say the one thing that we learned a lot about as far as optimizing was race conditions. So many race conditions, which for those of you who don't know is basically when you have two scripts that, depending on the state of the game, are trying to do two things at the same time that are conflicting with one another. It's two scripts are racing one another, so to speak. And I feel like that was kind of the biggest issue. That's not really an optimization problem, but it was definitely a pain in the butt. I'll just say out loud Brooks' joke because it's very funny. Knock knock, race condition. Who's there? We did create a special scenes for categories of objects like enemies at runtime. Yep, that was something that Eric implemented that was very helpful. Having a lot of data segregated by scene made it helpful for managing some data, as well as it helped a little bit with those race conditions as well. When do we get Eric's technical deep dive? Whenever Eric wants to set aside however many hours he wants to set aside to put together a presentation and give it. Okay, I think we've nearly hit 2 hours total on this presentation, so I feel like that's as good as any of a stopping point. Thank you so much to everybody who stuck around for the entire presentation and just listened to me ramble for as long as I did. I hope it was all interesting in some part or the other. I tried to cover a lot of ground so that at least a part would be interesting for some people. Um, and yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now.